Welcome to Marketing People Love. My name is Jacques Spitzer, and today we're going to be talking about how to see success advertising on podcasts with a podcast with Mr. Joey Kovac. And Joey was the man behind helping to scale Manscaped's presence on podcasts over the last 5-6 years, and is now one of the founders of an agency called Podscale, which is helping brands really learn and use and track podcasting and sponsoring podcasts as a actual scalable channel that directly brings sales for brands. We're going to talk about what type of brands are most ready, what they need to do to get started, how they're seeing success, how they are measuring the ROAS and the success, and including some interesting tracking that I didn't even know about. And we're going to talk about some of the biggest mistakes to avoid. So if you've ever been curious about what it takes to win with podcast advertising, then this is the episode for you. Joey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. You know, the first time we met in person was at a charity 3-on-3 basketball game. And I gotta say,
yes,
you're a good player.
Oh, I appreciate that. I was wondering where you're going with that because you guys definitely beat us in that game. And I appreciate you saying that we were good because we were not. We were terrible.
There's an asterisk to this because we only had 3 players and I was looking for a sub. And by the time we played you, I found a guy who was about 6'8", 275 that was sitting on the sidelines. And
I was wondering, okay, all right. Well, now that the truth has come out, one of the big reasons that I wanted to have you on was we met years and years ago when you were busy working to grow and scale Manscaped. We worked together there in some capacity. You and I didn't work directly together there, but we worked together with the Manscaped team. And one of the things that was just absolutely incredible was how you all really took to some of the channels that other people may not have been in, whether it was sponsoring, UFC fights or also jumping into podcasts, which has now become a full-time focus of yours. So give us a sense of like what that journey was like with specific to podcasting and, being out in front of those podcasts as a brand and being able to use it to grow your sales. What was that experience like with Manscaped? And just give us that sense of what you realized was possible with this as a medium for brands, as a channel, I should say.
Sure. Yeah, I joined Manscaped in 2018. And I was one of the top 10 employees, I think like 6 or something. And my first goal when I came on was just to expand our channel mix. I mean, they're essentially running Meta and some programmatic display. So I was just trying to test every channel I could in like a small capacity. And once we had a lot of those like paid media channels dialed in, we started to explore influencer marketing. And I had someone write into me on LinkedIn that had a podcast and was just willing to promote it for free and free product. And at the time I was like, sure, absolutely. Free deal, let's do it. And then I started watching the podcast and he was just promoting it, like the brand, like 10 times an episode. And he was just loving the brand and he was like doing skits for the brand. And we started to see sales come in too. And I was like, this is great. Like, this is a free deal. And man, there's like maybe something here. And then I got stopped in the grocery store. I was reading it, like wearing a Manscaped shirt. And a guy was like, oh, I heard you on that podcast. I was like, man, this is crazy. This is like, I mean, there's only like 1,000 people listening to this guy's podcast, but like enough to get like 5 sales an episode somehow. So then I typed in podcast advertising in my LinkedIn messages, and all the deals that I started to explore were like $1 million deals and like $100,000 year-long like promotions of a podcast. I was like, man, there's got to be like a way we can do these smaller tests, and eventually found Joey Diaz podcast, pretty famous comedian, not brand safe by any means, but he ended up doing a read for us, and it was just so funny, and the ROAS was like amazing. So I was like, all right, there's something here on the paid side as well. So started to explore podcast advertising as like not just a brand channel, as like I think a lot of people were looking at it as, because we were getting so much like efficient revenue from it. I like to call it brand formance. I also think Raindrop is like the brand.
We use it. We're all about brand formance. It's on our homepage. Here we are. I like it.
Love it. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the videos you guys make, I definitely put in that category, but I think it's rare to be able to find that, like something that works well. and then something that also is good for the brand. So I just realized like, oh, this is podcast advertising fits right in there. So really just started to test more and more podcasts. Eventually hired Natalie Kovac, who's now my wife, who ended up starting Podscale. We were essentially just being like reached out to by so many brands and so many agencies, like, hey, how are you guys able to scale this channel? Because there was like all these lists of like the top advertisers there. So a lot of people were, trying to poach her, and we just were just like, let's just start our own agency and see what happens. And it just really grew from there and became, working with some of the top D2C brands in the world.
And so the reason this all started as a, hey, I need to have you on the podcast, was you and I were having a discussion where we were catching up, and I was like, man, this is such valuable information, because it is, for so many brands, it's kind of a wild westy thing. Like, we're going to be going over all sorts of questions today about like, how do I get started? How do I track it? How do I know if I'm the right type of brand for this platform? What tends to work? What tends to not work? What kind of creatives do I need? Like, I have all these questions that just sort of tumbled out. And so I'd love to start with kind of like the where does a brand get started? Like, kind of thing where, if you're already out there and you're doing X number of dollars in revenue, which I'd love to get a sense from you of like what type of velocity you all tend to be like, this is kind of the minimum that I would add this channel in. So what would be sort of like a brand, or what stage should a brand be in? Do you think, are they primed to take on this channel? And then where and how do they get started? And even if they or working with you to do this, where do you all get started on their behalf? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've been surprised time and time again. Even sometimes we're like, I don't know if this is the best fit, and it tends to work well. So I think it is just a white space in a way, where there's just so much inventory and so many people listening to podcasts and not a lot of advertisers. I mean, I think you listen to a podcast, you do hear a lot of ads, but when you actually are buying the media, there's just so much inventory out there, and a lot of deals to be had, which is great. If I had to pick like the perfect brand to launch podcast advertising, I'd say over 30 million in annual revenue. And I'd say an average order value of like 75 to 200. And then probably the willingness to test like new categories, and kind of in the willingness to have the host ad lib and kind of speak in their own words. If you're super concerned about the host maybe saying something that you don't want them to, that is maybe something that like wouldn't be the best fit, because the best reads are the ones that they ad lib and they just go on a rant. You pay for a 60-second ad typically, but a lot of times they're a lot longer if they love the brand and they're encouraged to kind of speak in their own words. But we have brands that are seeing success that it's half of their marketing budget. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but sometimes you find something that works and you're able to scale it quickly. So it really depends, but that would be like the perfect brand if I had to pick.
So when you're looking at these brands, I'm sure that every single one, you kind of mentioned that you've been surprised by at times, like, wow, it really works, or it's a bigger percentage. One of the big questions I've had about it is, are brands that are very niched, like let's say you have a very niche audience and you want to be in front of a very specific audience, do those brands tend to work better? Let's say I'm a financial product and I'm now in front of people listening to a finance podcast or a business podcast, let's say, or do you tend to see that like, it's better if you're just like sunglasses or ball shavers, in this case of Manscaped, or, the most comfortable pants in the world or whatever, like a more broad thing that like, honestly, it doesn't really matter what podcast you end up on because it's so applicable broadly. Do you see broad work better, or do you see stuff that's like, okay, it's a more specific and I can get in front of a very specific audience? Like Manscaped to me is broad, but it's also specific because it's very male forward. I'm sure, like you said, you could be humorous and out there. I'm curious what you see to be like the best match for brands. Like, is it broad or is it niche or is it both?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think Apple Podcasts is saying there's like 5 million podcasts out there. Like, the majority of them no one's listening to, but there is a podcast for absolutely everything. I think in general for direct-to-consumer e-commerce brands, being broad and having a larger total addressable market is always going to be easier. It might cost more money to break in, but it's always going to be kind of easier to find people to purchase. But I will say too, if you have a really niche product, sometimes, especially on podcasts, it doesn't matter because the people are just purchasing products because they want to support the show. Like we've seen that a lot. And we'll see brands will be like, really, you want to run on this podcast for Dungeons and Dragons? And we're like, that doesn't really fit our core audience. And we're like, well, I think pretty much everything we run on this podcast is going to sell, because I think if you're listening to someone 3 hours a week and you're really into this podcast, you just want to, like, you feel like they're your friend and you just want to support them. And they might see an ad and they're just going to probably, if it's just somewhat resonates with them, they might purchase to support the show. So we find a lot of that, say it's in the business finance sector. It's actually kind of going outside of those sectors tend to perform a little better because there's maybe lower CPMs that you're going after because maybe it's not the most obvious podcast. You could hit the top 10 podcasts and they're probably going to be more expensive because there's just a lot more knowledge that they exist and it's a lot easier to launch on them. So it kind of depends. I mean, we've seen success with really niche products and I think you can scale potentially with a broader product and spend more, but we have niche products that do really well and they do well in categories probably wouldn't even ever think of.
That's really interesting. And so I imagine, I'm asking selfishly at this point about this next question. When I think about podcasts, I think to myself, there's probably, you mentioned, I think you said 5 million podcasts. Is that right? 5 million?
Yeah, I think there's something like 5 million podcasts on Apple.
So, look, I'm sure there's a bunch of people that have 500 to 3,000 listeners an episode, let's say, right? Sure. And so, to your point, it's like, that can be valuable. It can be quality over quantity. It can be all those things. And then you have the ones that have like an obvious big reach, which I just assume that those are ones where it's like, okay, yeah, like if you want to be, Joe Rogan's such a bad example because it's so big, but it's like, if you want to be on there, then they have their rate cards and they drive the conversation and they tell you how much it's going to be. So, let's say I am looking to invest, $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 a month into podcasting as a channel. How are you going about like is it block and tackle, having conversations with every single podcast out there, or like, are you setting the rates, or is it going into a system how does it mechanically work that you are able to get onto all of these different podcasts for the brands?
Yeah, I mean, that's why we started the agency. It's it can be really difficult to just hire someone in-house. We've spent over $100 million on podcast advertising. So we have a giant roster of podcasts that we know works for this demo, doesn't work for this demo. So we really are kind of different than most agencies where we're willing to go after the smaller podcasts. We're looking at it as like a performance channel that also has these great brand metrics. Like performance comes first for us. So a lot of times these smaller podcasts are the best performing ones as far as like a ROAS goes. So we're not scared to go after those. They can be a lot of work to launch a podcast, but so a lot of the agencies will just kind of stay away from it, or they'll just kind of go all in on a couple podcasts. Where we're, especially to start, we have a huge list of podcasts that we're trying to test. We're trying to test small and then see what works and then expand from there. I like to say we try for base hits and then we try for home runs, kind of depending on your budget. The home runs are great because sometimes you can have a giant celebrity. You could have the president come on and your views will go through the roof, but you're only paying for the views of like their average number of listeners. That's similar to a TV spot. Say, something happens, Will Smith, smack Chris Rock at the Oscars, you get a ton of viewership, you're hitting that home run. So we do try for those as well. But at first we're really looking for what are the most efficient podcasts for this particular demo to give, the brand confidence is going to work and show them like, hey, this is what your ROAS can be at this spend. So yeah, and it depends on the person's goals. Like sometimes we have people really looking for the most reach and, but really, our specialty is performance.
Okay. Perfectly leading my next question around performance. How in the world do you go about triangulating success of this? I have my assumptions, which would be almost more, you hear everyone say, well, use promo code blank or go to, manscaped.com/Jacques, which I would never do because my name's impossible to spell. We'll say /marketing people love, for your X, Y, and Z discount. How in the world are you all triangulating and figuring out ROAS and success? Because I find this very interesting because you have that real time buy, it sounds like, but you also you get such a strong brand impression, especially if it's a read coming from the hosts themselves. So help me understand how you all are triangulating success here.
Yeah, I mean, there's all the brand metrics that kind of come with podcasts, and we almost always consistently see those brand metrics rise, but that's really not what we're focused on. You nailed the kind of first pillar of attribution with the code usage. And I do want to say there's no silver bullet for attribution. Everyone has their own methodologies, and we create a custom attribution look depending on what the client feels most important. I can't say that there's one silver bullet for everything, but I would say the more data, the better. So we do look at code usage or vanity URL. It just depends on what you use. It could be, /Manscaped or whatever. Or you could say, use this code for 20% off. And then you track the code uses. Of course, codes do sometimes leak. Some brands are way better at preventing those leaks than others with certain techniques. But that is one pillar to look at. Another pillar to look at is pixel tracking. So you can place a pixel on the RSS feed of the podcast, and then it can actually track based on your IP whether or not you've listened and then purchased. So I think a lot of people don't know about the pixel tracking aspect to it. And you can't put a pixel on YouTube, so some of it is modeled if they're looking at YouTube, which we actually feel like it underreports because you're more likely to purchase based on our data if you're watching it as opposed to just listening to it. So we do think it actually is underreporting, but once you have the pixel tracking, you can really splice up a lot of great things. You can do incrementality testing. You can do new customer versus returning customer, different look back windows. So, it is evolving over time and becoming, a lot more data points to go after, which is great. And then another pillar is post-purchase survey that a lot of brands use. And we do have a custom model where, you either look at all of them or look at one of them. It just kind of depends. Can't say that, we've cracked the attribution code completely, but we're looking at a lot of different data points, and we're really approaching podcast as more of like a paid media channel than I think most brands and agencies are currently doing.
Very cool. I mean, the pixel component to that is something that is totally new to me. I had no idea that you could do that, that you could triangulate. Because I'm like, I knew about post-purchase. I had a feeling people would be relying on some aspect of promo code, but I had no idea that you could track the IP address, which I'm guessing would also extend to their mobile device as well, depending on how that works. Yeah. Really interesting.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's a great feature to have, and and if you're looking at one attribution source, it's fine, and you can probably get a pretty good idea if it's working. But if you really are starting to scale and you really want to look at each individual podcast and you really want to make it like a core part of your marketing channel, we have a lot of different techniques and different ways to look at it and kind of give you a look and compare it to other channels. I mean, there's also a lot of brands using MMAs and MTAs and things like that as well. So podcasts are becoming more and more trackable, and there's a lot of, I think, companies, attribution companies are realizing like podcast advertising is not going anywhere, and like it's a big part of a lot of people's marketing mix, and we need to create products that are helping our current clients be able to track. So we're working with a lot of third-party vendors and just trying to make the tracking as best possible.
What kind of issues, or I should say, what kind of things, like the biggest mistakes, are you seeing with brands where they try to jump into this channel and they make blank mistakes, fill in the blank for me, and then they just decide, you know what, this channel won't work for us? Very, very curious what you tend to see when it comes to those common mistakes that you all, honestly, just working with you helps people to avoid from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, our success rate at Podscale is like shockingly high, like over 90%. So we feel pretty confident if, we say, hey, this is a good fit, let's move forward. We feel pretty confident, like we're gonna be able to get this to work. But we do have brands that we've seen that will tell us, hey, I've tried it before, it doesn't work. And 99% of the time, it's they did one deal with one podcast, or they did one programmatic deal where they spent $200,000 on just throwing their ad out there, similar to a radio ad where we've all listened to podcasts where there's kind of recorded ads come up. That's not the host reading. That is the most common thing we hear when like, hey, it didn't work, is we put $200,000 into that and we saw 3 sales, and we were told like, oh, it's going to be great for your brand. And look how many impressions you got, which there's something to be said about that. I mean, there's obviously reach marketing that is successful.
Yeah, I feel you. I mean, and look, there's a lot of brands that maybe they're fully at retail and only at retail, and they will never be able to fully track, the impact of some of these things. But we all know in the direct to consumer component of this, it's like, what you want to be able to do is create some sort of predictable outcome as you increase the investment and are able to grow it as a real channel. I mean, that's what you were able to do with Manscaped, is what you're doing now. And so I could see where I mean, we get it too, right? We get people that on our end as an agency, like people will make creative for a variety of reasons, and it's not everyone always wants something to do well. That's the goal. But a lot of times people will be like, oh yeah, I made this ad, and it's like that maybe it doesn't, it's all vibes and there's no explanation of what the product or brand even does. And then they put it out on connected television, put a bunch of money behind it, and they're like, I don't know if it worked. And that was, hundreds of thousands, if not more, sometimes even in the millions, unfortunately. And like, I have no idea if this had impact. And that can be tough. To your point, it's almost like there is no wasted impression, especially if you're fully in retail. But when you're direct to consumer, like you need there to be a tighter attribution, connection or window. It's so uncritical. I can imagine that, a lot of times when people hire an agency, and the agencies get a bad rep all the time, which I get it, like rightfully so. Like I'm not going to sit here and defend all agencies, but I will say a lot of times you are paying for all the lessons that have been learned. Or like to your point, you're like, yeah, I mean, when you've done this for so many different, not only your own brand or for Manscaped, but now for all these other brands, it's like, oh, we've learned a lot about what has worked and what hasn't worked, and it saves you time and money to not have to replicate certain mistakes. And that's why I was so curious about what kind of mistakes people are making. On the flip side, what's one thing that you're like, you tend to see over and over again that like, this is something that I hate to call it low-hanging fruit, but it's something that just seems to work for brands who are getting into the podcast space?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's shocking where a brand is just crushing it in other channels, and they're not running on podcasts yet. Like, how'd you get this far without running on podcasts? Like, so I mean, if a brand is seeing success in a lot of other channels, podcast is almost certainly going to work for them as well. So that's kind of just the obvious one. Like, if you're doing influencer marketing and it's working, podcast is very similar in a sense, and actually will likely be more efficient spend for you. But yeah, another one is just like the strong marketing angle. If you have a really strong marketing angle, and what I try and define that as is, this is your old product was doing this, and it's bad. Your new product is doing this and it's way better. And it's like pretty simple as that. But if you have a really strong one of those, it really resonates with the podcast host. They can talk about the old product, why it sucked, why the new product is great, and they can just kind of go on a riff. Like I said, you pay for 60 seconds typically, but if the product really resonates, if they really love that strong marketing angle, that is just kind of the low-hanging fruit where you can get these really great celebrities and comedians that would be so expensive to get in a commercial or even just on their social media, and you can get them talking about your brand and kind of doing the creative on their own and writing skits for you for way cheaper than if you were gonna, try and do some much larger deal with them. So it's that really strong marketing angle that you think these kind of hosts that are paid to talk anyway, to kind of riff on that marketing angle, that's where we see the most success.
And I will say that you said it earlier in the podcast, but it really resonated with me where it's like, I think what people underestimate about podcasts is you develop a parasocial relationship. It's a very fancy way of saying, like,
I like that.
I listen to Derek Thompson's podcast every week, and I'm like, I feel creepy. I'm like, this guy's Derek Thompson. I'm like, I feel creepy because I've been listening to him for years. I feel like I know him. Like, I know he has a kid because it's like he talks about being a dad. He talks about this, and I'm like, I feel like I know him, but he has no idea who I am. And then I'm sure that's very similar. This has been a dynamic for years and years. Is why people feel this way about celebrities. They feel like they know them, even though they don't. But I've heard there's millions of women that feel like they know Taylor Swift and they've never met her, kind of thing. It's like. But there is something about listening to these podcast people, and you do develop a one-directional relationship with them. And so when they say, "Hey, like I use this product," or "I'm being sponsored by this product," it is almost like you said, like a friend or like a family member telling you, like, "Hey, this," like, especially if they're smaller, it's like, "Hey, I do this, and you get value from it, and these people are supporting me." And like, if you were thinking about buying pants, then buy your pants here, because like it's almost like the same idea of like why I would go to my local hardware store to give them my money than to go to another store that maybe sells the same thing for $2 more. It's like I'd rather spend my money with the guy I know locally. It's just that psychology is still there with the podcast, and I could see why those reads that are very authentic work, even if it's not something that it's like, why would I be taking, for instance, like if Derek Thompson, who tends to talk about like recent events and innovations in local politics, if all of a sudden he started talking about his favorite coffee, like, why would I buy the coffee he's talking about? And it's like, I don't know him as my coffee guy. I'm not, well, this is this coffee, but I trust him and I like him. And if he likes it, I'm like, oh, I'll check it out. And or I should say, it increases the likelihood that I would check it out. Can't say I would definitely check it out, but that's what CPMs are for. You need 1 or 2 out of 1,000 people to say yes, not every person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I experienced it myself because I obviously listen to a lot of podcasts now, and I'll meet these podcast hosts. Natalie, my wife, is the CEO of Podscale. We went over to Bert Kreischer's house. Shout out to Bert Kreischer. But it was very strange meeting him. I was like, I know you. You don't know who I am. And I think it's even more so than a celebrity because a lot of the successful podcasters are very vulnerable. It's like part of what is the appeal. So they're talking to their audience and you just feel like they're your friend and you know them. And I've experienced firsthand where it's like, I know so much about you. You know nothing about me. It's great to meet you.
What's funny is when someone's done with this episode, they're gonna be like, that Joey guy, he seems to know what he's talking about when it comes to these podcast things.
And multiply that by 3 hours a week, that you 5 years that you've been listening to someone.
I love it. No, I mean, look, that's the reality of this. The reason I started this podcast period was that I genuinely felt guilty that I had access to this information and these conversations that I couldn't or wasn't sharing with people more broadly. And that's when you and I were catching up, that's legitimately how I felt. I'll say it in the intro and I'm saying it again now. Like, that's how I felt. I was like, oh man, like I'm talking to someone in the top 1% of 1% of all podcast advertising as a channel understanding and success. And you all have gone out now and started your own agency. And so I was like, I selfishly want to know more about this, but I also want to be able to share it with brands that are out there that are in that space of trying to figure out, is this a channel that I can invest in and track and see returns from? And so hopefully they have a little bit more confidence coming out of this than before. And if they are interested, obviously they can get in touch with you and maybe you can share a little bit about where, but also maybe closing out too, like I'd love to hear what type of questions should they be considering as they're thinking about reaching out to you?
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to share the love. I love what Raindrop's doing. You guys, and you starting your own agency is an inspiration as well. So just wanted to say that. So thank you for the
Appreciate
kind words as
that.
well. Yeah, I mean, you can podscalemedia.com has some information, and there's a form to fill out if you're interested. And of course, hit me up on LinkedIn. I get a lot of messages through there for brands reaching out. So either one is great. Yeah, and I mean, the questions to ask are, I think, are you just looking to be less reliant on Meta is kind of the main thing I get people reaching out. They're saying, hey, we're 80% or higher on Meta and we're seeing a lot of success, but I think it scares us, or there could be, the last update was, we saw a big drop, and you're looking for another efficient performance marketing channel to test. I mean, that's kind of one of the main ones. Or if you're a big brand that somehow found a lot of success and never launched on podcast advertising, that is low hanging fruit for sure, like you said. And yeah, I would love to talk to more brands. So feel free to reach out. I think, the success rate is really high. So we feel confident in saying that.
That's what we have for you today. Thank you for joining us for Marketing People Love. And if you enjoyed this conversation with Joey, with these such interesting guests who have the top 1% of 1% of knowledge in these different brands and categories, if you want to know more about topics like these, please make sure to follow along and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, I hope you all keep creating marketing that people love.